as the Wellington Lodge President, Simon Webber, to introduce June Vallyon, who is our Vice President of the Wellington Lodge. June has a BA in Religious Studies, a Graduate Diploma of Arts in History, and a Golden Key National Honour Society Award from Waikato University, and Honours in History from Massey University, where her dissertation was Countess Wachtmeister and the New Zealand Theosophical Society in 1896, which was about the Countess's lecture tours in Australia and New Zealand in 1895 and 1896. June has served in the TSNZ in many capacities, and as I said, she's currently the Vice President of the Wellington Lodge. She was previously the President of the Tauranga Lodge as well. June will be examining how H.P. Blavatsky and Theosophy fits into what was going on during the 19th century, which was a time of great expansion of thought and questioning of generally accepted theories of how humanity fitted into the universe. Blavatsky actively participated in this discussion, clashed with many of the leading thinkers of her time, and with her teachers, presented a comprehensive view of life as she saw it. So June's topic is H.P. Blavatsky, Questioning 19th Century Science, Materialism and Spiritualism. So June, it's great to have you here. Over to you. Thanks.
Right. Well, I didn't actually get as far with the questioning 19th century science, materialism, as I had hoped. But the general idea, as has already been said, was to provide a general backgrounder that later speakers can build on. So where did I start? I want you to open this meeting with a talk about the life of Madame Blavatsky. Well, what could be so difficult about that? Just choose a biography, take a timeline from it as your base. Okay, which biography? Do I take the devotional approach of Theosophist Sylvia Cranston's HPB, The Extraordinary Life and Influence of Helena Blavatsky, founder of modern Theosophical movement? Or do I take a book that was very popular in the 1990s and is often quoted by academics, Peter Washington's Madame Blavatsky's Baboon? I once wrote in a review of Washington's book that it was, quote, a gay romp through the rumored sexual adventures of a variety of early theosophical and spiritual leaders, which reads like the pages of the worst of the British gutter press, a novel not to be taken as having any historical value whatsoever. A third option might be Mary K. Neff's personal memoirs of H.P. Blavatsky, which I obtained a copy of recently from my mother's estate. And this is mainly a collection of contemporary source material. And it does have an appendix with timelines, 2 of them, and they don't coincide with each other. In Madame Blavatsky, the mother of modern spirituality, Gary Lachman goes on at some length about the impossibility of doing any coherent biography, and then spends the rest of his book doing just that. And if you think Helena Petrovna Blavatsky is any less controversial in the 21st century than she was in the 19th, then just type the name Blavatsky into Google search or walk into a university lecture theatre. Now, the current version of the ever-changing Wikipedia article, while very well referenced, is generally derogatory and quotes as much from Washington's Baboon as it does from Gary Lachman's book, with a very light sprinkling of Cranston. I can, however, recommend a Lachman for anybody who wants an easily read and relatively unbiased modern account of HPB's life, which in a Penguin edition is readily available. He also has a long series of books about of other teachers of his time and several new ones that I'm going to have a closer look at. Today, I want to explore some aspects of Madame Blavatsky's life in the context of the times that she lived in, to give a base for the people who will be speaking about her. Now, about her teachings this weekend. Some of these teachings are timeless and eternal and have been reincarnated through many philosophies and religions ever since humanity first looked at the sun and wondered where its light came from, or where did the life of someone go when they died. Other teachings that have attached themselves to the name of Blavatsky and Theosophy are more to do with the general mindset and interest of the late Victorian era. So who was Helena Petrovna Blavatsky? She was born as Helena Petrovna von Hahn on the August of 12th, 1831, our calendar, or July 30th in the old Julian calendar in the Ukraine. Now, I'm not going to insult Russian ears by trying to pronounce any of these Ukrainian names. But the Ukraine at the time was an area of fluid boundaries and multiple ethnicities, and it was in the middle of a cholera epidemic. So many people had died in her grandfather's house where she was born so quickly that the coffins were piled up in the house, waiting their turn to be buried. Helena's 17-year-old mother had the disease. Baby Helena was premature and neither were expected to survive. Helena's father was not present. He'd been sent to Poland to suppress a rebellion against the Russian occupiers. One of my own Polish ancestors was a leader in that rebellion. Labeled an insurgent, he escaped Poland with a brother and a cousin, and after a period of imprisonment in Austria, he eventually settled in Paris with many other Polish refugees. Back to baby Helena. A Russian Orthodox priest was called in to baptize the newborn baby because it was believed that anybody who died unbaptized would spend the whole of eternity in limbo. Even worse, especially for the servants, it was a common folk belief in Eastern Europe at that time that the souls of unbaptized girls would become Vela. They were beautiful and extremely dangerous river spirits who had a reputation for their powers over wind and water and the ability to charm any man who annoyed them to dance until they died from sheer exhaustion. To avoid this dire fate, the infant needed to be baptized immediately. Now, Russian Orthodox ceremonies are long and they are chanted. The room was crowded with extended family, retainers and serfs, all carrying lighted tapers. Perhaps it's not surprising then that one of Helena's aunts, a child not much older than herself, fell asleep, dropped her taper, and set fire to the priest's robes. The elderly priest and several of the congregation were badly burnt before the fire was put out. Now, all this drama that started HPB's life was taken to be a very bad omen. Certainly, it was the beginning of a life filled with drama, controversy, and mystery. 11 years later, Helena's mother, when dying of galloping consumption, which is TB, is supposed to have said, "Oh, well, perhaps it is best that I am dying, so at least I shall be spared seeing what befalls of Helene. Of one thing I am certain, Her life will not be as that of other women, and she will have much to suffer. So with her father traveling with his artillery regiment, 11-year-old free spirit Helena, with her younger brother and sister, was sent to live with their grandmother. Now here we have three truly remarkable and highly educated women. Grandmother Helene Dolgoruki spoke 5 languages, painted, was a numismatist and an archaeologist, and a natural science in communication with leading scientists of her day. One wing of her palace held a collection of Caucasian flora, all labeled with their Latin names and scientific descriptions. Mother, Helena Fedosevna von Hahn, was a popular author described as the Russian George Sand, who wrote 12 novels in her short life, some of them published posthumously. In them, she described the wretched position of women, their lack of opportunity and education, and gave voice to the idea of their ultimate emancipation in an era when Russia still had serfs. Like many women writers of her time, she used a pseudonym, Zenaida R. Va. Now, the Wikipedia article I mentioned earlier claims that all 3 of these women, grandmother, mother, and daughter, were, quote, self-educated. In an era when there was little formal education for boys and none at all for girls, perhaps the writer thought that a school or a series of untrained young woman babysitters called governesses were the only form of education available. He was very much mistaken. Even with all the advantages of modern life, the family is often the prime driver of how far anybody goes with their education. Grandmother not only supervised the education of the von Hahn children and their cousin, she also had an incredible library where young Helena, having escaped from her governess, could be found deep in a book or conversing with some stuffed animal. This place seems to have been very much crowded with artifacts and stuffed animals and things of the like in the manner of a Victorian boudoir. There was already a history of interest in occultism and spiritualist endeavors in the family. Helena's great-grandfather had been a Rosicrucian Freemason and had an extensive library of occult, alchemical, and Kabbalistic books, which must have been part of the grandmother's library because Helena discovered them and read them while still in her teens. Her sister, younger sister, Vera, wrote that when mischief making had run its course, no old scholar could be more assiduous in his study, and she could not be prevailed upon to give up her books, which she would devour day and night as long as the impulse lasted. Vera also gave vivid descriptions of the places they lived in with their grandparents and a huge retinue of servants and serfs. And when the serfs were emancipated, they actually accompanied the family as waged servants. This great country mansion occupied by us at Saratov was an old and vast building full of subterranean passages, long abandoned passages, turrets, and the most weird nooks and corners. It looked more like a medieval ruined castle than a building of the last century. We had been permitted to explore under the protection of half a dozen male servants and a quantity of torches and lanterns. True, we had found in these underground passages more broken wine bottles than human bones, and it had gathered more cobwebs than iron chains. But our imagination suggested ghosts in every flickering shadow from the old damp walls. Helena, made this place a refuge from her governess, who was scared of the ghosts. Another time, she could be found in the rafters of the old house, hypnotizing the pigeons, or even in the forest behind it. At this time, as well as the ghosts in the old house, Helena learned much from an old hermit beekeeper, herbalist, and sorcerer, who lived in a hut surrounded by beehives in the forest. Whenever Helena had a chance, she would visit this old man, asking questions and listening to his explanations. He was reputed to be, quote, be a sorcerer of a good, benevolent kind, who cured willingly all the patients who applied to him, but also knew how to publish with disease those who sinned. He was greatly versed in the knowledge of the occult properties of plants and flowers, and could read the future. It also speaks of him singing to his bees and wandering around with them all over his body, which must have seemed quite magical to any witnesses. At another time, an entire summer was spent with an uncle traveling in the area of the Canucks, nomadic cattle herders who were practitioners of the far western extent of Tibetan Buddhism. Helena had spent time with them before, learning to ride and associating with the peasant children rather than her aristocratic peers and the governesses, who were supposed to be teaching her how to take her place in the Russian aristocratic life. But now, older and still curious about the Canucks' life and ways, she'd learned enough Tibetan to question her elders and quite learned how to use a prayer wheel, which means that she must have learned something about their religious practices and beliefs. So back in her grandparents' house, which by this time was in Georgia in the Caucasus, the question of Helene taking her proper station in life as the wife of some suitable aristocrat came up again. Remembering that her mother had married a man twice her age at 16, and Helene was a year older. In Britain, girls of Helene's social status would be attending coming out and debutante balls, announcing that they were in the marriage market, looking for someone suitably aristocratic, rich, and preferably of a higher status than the girl. Love, or the girl's preference, didn't often have very much to do with it, and even less once they were married. So there are many quite different stories told about why Helene married Nikifor Blavatsky on the 17th of July, 1848, just before her 17th birthday. He was vice governor of Yerevan in Armenia, a neighboring and even more remote province of Russia at the time. About the only thing that is clear is that the marriage didn't last. Helene turned up back at her grandfather's house in Georgia. He didn't know what to do with the runaway. Grandmother was ill. Maybe her father could talk some sense into her. So he decided to pack her off to her father, who was in St. Petersburg, which is quite some distance away. There was no railways in this far corner of Russia, so the journey was to be made by coach and steamer up the coast of the Black Sea to the nearest railhead, where she could travel the rest of the way to her father in St. Petersburg. But Helena, always the rebel, had other ideas. At the first stop, she sent her accompanying servants ashore to manage a night's accommodation, jumped ship, and hid on an English steamer bound for Constantinople. To avoid detection by the harbour police there, she is said to have swapped clothes with a cabin boy and impersonated him while the real cabin boy hid in the coal bunker. At this point, Helene's family did not hear from her for 10 years, apart from her father, who periodically sent her the money to keep up her adventurous lifestyle. Tales told about Helene's extensive travels at this time are contradictory at best, possibly heavily embroidered by herself and others. And frankly, some of the stories told by some of her detractors are absurd to the point of complete impossibility. However, she wasn't alone as a traveller. Besides travelling with other women that she knew or befriended on the way, it was quite common for Western women adventurers of this time to disappear into the sunset. Many of the early women archaeologists in Egypt, many of the earlier, oh no, I did write that wrong, were women. And there was at least one prominent English woman who rode into Arabia and eventually married a sheikh, becoming an English negotiator and spy. There was even a film made about this lady. From available accounts, some of varying credibility, about the only major area that Blavatsky did not visit was the Pacific Islands, Australia, and New Zealand. According to Mary Neff, there was an aim to this apparent wandering. Everywhere she went, Blavatsky sought out people like her old friend, the beekeeping healer and mystic. Books had been left behind. Now was the time to explore life in its fullest. Some of these people turned out to be real. Many were charlatans and tricksters. An attempt to set up a spiritual society in Cairo with a group of people, including a hotel worker called Emma Cutting, was to have serious consequences later. Blavatsky discovered that at least some of the mediums she had hired, including Emma, were frauds and sacked them all. According to Lathman, Blavatsky had come to the conclusion that the spirits that had been contacted were, quote, not the souls of the dear departed, but a species of astral hobo, psychic tramps with nothing better to do than hover near the borderland between the living and the dead, looking for some mischief. It was this insight that would lead to the lifelong feud between HBB and the major spiritualists of this time. There might, however, be another reason for this feud, and the one with the Society for Psychical Research later. There was a huge upsurge in interest in all forms of spiritualism and occultism at the time. These groups saw Blavatsky as competing for the same target market and therefore a threat to their own popularity. Another adventure at this time involved Blavatsky fighting in Garibaldi's forces and getting wounded in the Battle of Smetana in November 1867 during his campaign to unify Italy and free it from its Austrian and Spanish overlords. There are detractors who say that any women were only camp followers, some of doubtful repute. It certainly isn't true of Garibaldi, whose own wife fought alongside him and even gave birth on or near one of his battlefields. The Victoria and Albert Museum also states there are records of women taking on roles alongside soldiers in the American Civil War. Women were also known to dress as men and fight alongside the soldiers. Apart from the French, and who actually have a name which I can't pronounce, and the work of amateur historians on their American counterparts, little research has been done to the vast and extensive body of academic scholarship and research on other military aspects, including women who disguised themselves as men to fight. I've also read that on British warships of the time, there were a lot of women and children, and even schools where the children were educated very well for the British Navy. After many attempts, Blavatsky also states that she was able to enter Tibet and study with her masters there. Naturally, this is considered by her detractors to have been impossible for a European woman because the borders were closed and the entry was restricted by the English as much as the actual physical difficulty of getting there. But what are these detractors thinking of? A slight blonde-haired, pale-faced and rosy-cheeked Englishwoman? Remember that Blavatsky had already been known to disguise herself as a man, and that Alcott's first description of her commented on her Kalmuk features. She already knew enough Tibetan and enough of the Kalmuk practices to pass herself off as one of her own childhood friends. The late Lama K.D. Sandip believed that in spite of malevolent critics of Blavatsky's works, this author has undisputable proofs that she was well acquainted with the highest Lama's teaching, and for this she needs to get an initiation. Dr. Malakestra, founder and president of the World Buddhist Brotherhood, wrote about Blavatsky in a monumental Buddhism encyclopedia. Quote, her acquaintance with Tibetan Buddhism and also with the esoteric Buddhism practices is indubitable. Thus, Japan philosopher and Buddhologist D.T. Suzuki supposes that, quote, undoubtedly, Ms. Blavatsky somehow or another was initiated into the deep propositions of the Mahayana teaching. Blavatsky herself said, really, it is quite useless to go to Tibet or India to recover some knowledge or power that are hidden in any human soul, but acquisition of higher knowledge and power requires not only many years of intensive studying under the guidance of higher mind, together with a resolution that cannot be shaken by any danger, and as much as years of relative solitude, in communication with disciples only, which pursue the same aim, and in such a place where both the nature and the neophyte preserve a perfect and unbroken rest, if not the silence. There, the air is not poisoned by miasmas around hundreds of miles, and there the atmosphere and human magnetism are quite clear, and there the animal's blood is never shed. According to biographers, H.P. Blavatsky's path led not to Lhasa, but to Tashi Lungpo Monastery near Shigatse. Having finally reached and being taught by her master, she says not in the monastery itself, because if you became a monk, you would have had to have stayed there, but in a house near it. Blavatsky was eventually instructed to go to America. While in New York and maintaining her interest in spiritualism, she decided to go and investigate some phenomena that were happening in the Eddy household in Chittenden, still investigating the unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in humanity. And also a certain Colonel Alcott, writing a series of columns on the manifestations presented there, arrived at the same time. See this, it's too. The dinner hour at Eddy's was noon, he writes, And it was from the entrance door of the bare and comfortless dining room that Naps, an artist who was accompanying him to draw the phenomena, and I first saw HPB. She had arrived shortly before noon with a French-Canadian lady, and they were at table as we entered. I was first attracted by a scarlet Garibaldi shirt the former wore, as in vivid contrast to the dull colours around. So I made one. And you can imagine, if everybody else was dressed in black and lavender and pale blue, a shirt like this would have attracted a lot of attention.
Excellent, June.
Whoops, just about tipping over my Her hair was then a thick blonde mop, worn shorter than the shoulders, and it stood out from her head, silken soft and crinkled to the roots like the fleece of a Cotswold ewe. This and the red shirt were what struck my attention before I took in the picture of her features. It was a massive Kalmuck face, contrasting in its suggestion of power, culture, and imperiousness, as strangely with the commonplace visages around the room as her red garment did with the grey and white tones of the walls and woodwork and the dull costumes of the rest of the guests. All sorts of cranky people were continually coming and going at the Eddies to see the mediumistic phenomena, and it only struck me on seeing this eccentric lady that this was only one more of the sort. Pausing on the doorsill, I whispered to Naps, "Good gracious, look at that specimen, will you?" Dinner over, the two went outside, and Madame Blavatsky pulled herself a cigarette, for which I offered her a light as a pretext to enter into conversation. And from there, as Theosophists, which way up? The rest is history. And if there is anyone who wants any questions, I will endeavour to answer them.
Okay, great, June. Fantastic. So Sushi will do questions and we'll put the screen so I can see. So if anyone wants to raise their hand with a question, just either do it physically or use the little option for the reaction button where you can raise your hand.
I was wondering, June, if you could tell us a little bit about the materialistic attitude of the time, please.
Yes. Well, once we had people coming into getting a little more education and books becoming a bit more available, we had people like Charles Darwin talking about evolution, and there was among both the main thinkers of the time a rebellion against the idea that the Bible was the only authority and that Earth was a creation, when people were beginning to trace out just how long this existence had been. Also, in the previous time, there had been, right even from the late 17th century, translations from the Sanskrit had been appearing in Britain. So there was already growing an interest in other religions and in alongside the interest in spiritualism, we have things going in three different directions. We have people getting interested in spiritualism and the occult. There was an idea at the time that spiritualism could be scientifically investigated, which was common among some spiritualists and also by the Society for Psychical Research. Unfortunately, methods used by some of them were anything but scientific. You have a revival, a Christian revival, which develops into the Methodist, Presbyterian, and the various congregational churches that grew up at the time. And you have an academic revival, which a lot of it coming out of the newly founded London University, which another ancestor of mine went to, where they were looking at things, some of them were looking at things from a much more physical and materialist point of view. So you get these various groups battling among each other, and also, particularly in the spiritualist and occultist field, battling each other within their groups. So there was a lot of academic conflict going on at the time. Yeah, is that answer your question, Sushma?
Yes, thank you.
Chris, you had your hand up before.
Oh, yes. I was just going to say thank you, June. You know, over these many years, the many presentations I've heard on the life of HPB, I have to say that yours today has been the most gripping. And I think that's because you gave us enough detail of the early life for us to get an appreciation of a very colourful, eventful, dramatic life right from the word go. Fascinating. Two questions. One is that at a quite an early age, if I recall correctly, she became aware of being communicated with by others who were not in incarnation or were not actually there in the same location. So I'm interested in what you have to say about that. And also I'm interested to know at what point in this remarkable life did she actually become aware of this destiny that she'd been born to, that she was to bring this revelation that was really the main point of her life at that time round. Thanks, June.
Well, as to becoming aware of other beings, she was aware of them from very early in childhood. Not only the protector, who she eventually recognized as her master, but also the spooks and various other sorts of entities around that were inhabiting this house and its immediate surroundings. As to when she became aware that she actually had a destiny, I couldn't tell you actually when that would have happened. I think it might have grown over a period of time under the instruction of her master. Except she might have well known what was not her destiny, like being an aristocratic housewife, having children and throwing parties for her husband. I think it became pretty clear pretty early on with Blavatsky that it just wasn't going to work for either of them. Some of her later writings are a little more sympathetic to him. So as to the first, I think all her life, and as to the second, I just don't know.
Okay, thank you.
I'll just read a couple of comments. Susanna has said, love the shirt, June, and love the tales of HPB. Pam has said, great talk, June. Arnie has said, thanks, June, for the magnificent 19th century attire, reliving HPB. And it's great when we see you at conventions with all of that shirt on. And he goes on to say, your talk was rewinding the mystic maze of HB's extraordinary life. Fantastic talk. And Susanna has said, fascinating, intrigued by the beekeeping mystic, and love the red shirt, June. Yeah, interesting, the beekeeping mystic. Yeah, so I've got a couple more minutes for anything else in terms of questions or comments, because we're going to be starting at 2:45 for our next session. And we'll have a bit of silence before that. Oh, here's Louise put a post, comments. HPB was such a colourful character, and her letters reveal quite a temperament. There are so many stories I am familiar with. I was amazed to hear of more. I also loved the reference to the other woman of the time. This is something that has surprised me a lot in places where women are secondary without educational opportunities, particularly in India. The shirt was a lovely touch. So thanks, Louise. And it's just on the buy. It's interesting because in those early times, we've just had in Wellington, some of you probably have seen it, Hilma af Klint exhibition, and she joined the Swedish section in about 1882, around there, 1883, and she was inspired by the work of the society and HPB and women of her time. So you know what HPB has done, particularly when the society was founded, has provided these opportunities for women in particular. So. Okay, Sushma, yes.
I'd like to share with you to answer Chris's question. There was a time when HPB was around 21 years old when she was in London, and she spotted the person she had been seen in visions, who she recognized as the person who had protected her in a couple of life-threatening situations. She saw him in a procession. She was about to approach him, and he indicated not to do so. But later on in Hyde Park, she met him. And I think at that time he told her that possibly that they would be doing this type of work. So that's when she first time heard about probably what Chris called her destiny. What I found most interesting is that when she went and mentioned this to her father and asked his permission, he said yes. I mean, think about it, in 19th century world, a father, I mean, who would have said that to their daughter, that, okay, you can go and do this work. And also the thing is, until she was in her early 40s, the work didn't begin. So in the 20 years in between, all that June talked about of her travels and things, all that happened. So I think that's the first time she might have heard about what is in store for her and what her purpose in life might be. Chris has her hand up.
Yes, I was just going to say thank you again for that. Yes, I knew about what happened in Hyde Park, but I didn't know at what age that happened. And it's clear that she was born into a family that would nurture the beginning of this remarkable life. However, when you say age 21, when probably the first realization started to come to her, the courage, because with her ability, she must surely, we probably all had the experience of having a premonition of something ahead of us that we understand will be challenging, and I'm sure she must have had that. So it just occurred to me when you were speaking that she must have felt an enormous love coming from her master that supported her in being willing to go on the journey that she took.
I think Ganesh
I think
Ganesh is going to be dealing with that, because I asked him when I asked him would he please talk about that part of her life. So yes.
All right. Thank you, Chris. Okay, so I'd like to give a vote of thanks to June. Your great presentation, really appreciated. So thank you very much. So I close this session, and we'll have a moment's silence.